the thing is that I can take you back almost 100 years, you see.
Which is amazing.
And that's, to me, you won't get any other opportunities, I'm sure.
When I placed an advert in the newsletter of Rose Village Retirement Home, Helen Bird was the second person to get back to me. She left me a voicemail in which she proudly told me right off the bat that she was 99 years old and she wanted to share her story with me. I spoke to Helen for more or less 3 hours, and she detailed to me everything from her upbringing to the things that she has learned throughout her life and the things that she still hopes to do. At the time of recording, Helen was 99 years old, and by the time this podcast is put up, she will be 100. Talking to her was incredible, not only to get a glimpse back 99 years in time, but also to get a personal connection with somebody who has lived through so much political change, technological change, and the social change that comes with every passing year. There is a lot to be learned from people who have seen different eras and people who have lived through different events. I learned a lot from talking to Helen, and I hope that you can learn just as much as I did by listening to this podcast.
Well, I was born in 1921, and my first memories are we were living on a farm, a rented farmhouse outside Fort Beaufort. My father was a railway engineer, and he built the narrow gauge line from there to Hog's Back. I believe it's defunct now. And my mother was the niece of General Louis Botha, and she had an English father, quite strange in those days. But we lived on this farm, and I had a very beloved brother who was 2 years older than I was, and I had a sister who was 4.5 years older, and she didn't play any role in my life whatsoever. I did everything with Mike, my brother. Then my father was sent to supervise the railways down in Mpumalanga, and he was given a coach with 2 bedrooms and a lounge and a dining room and bathroom, and he could hook that coach behind any train when he wanted to go anywhere. But unfortunately, while he went there to look for a house, because that's where we'd have to move to, and he got cerebral malaria, and he died within 10 days when I was 6. Now, when we lived on this farm, you must picture what life was like in those days, because we had no fridges, we had no washing machines, we had no hoovers. Our fridge, if you can call it a fridge, was a big square box with the sides double-sided on each side with Coke. And then we used to put one of those, you used to get paraffin in tins in those days, a big tin, which was about 8 inches high and sort of 15 inches square. And that was put on top of this box with a hole in the bottom. And all day it dripped down into the Coke and fell into the garden because it was hung on a tree outside the kitchen door. That was our so-called fridge. And when we moved to Pretoria, we got an ice chest. Now, you probably don't know why it was called an ice chest, because it opened at the top, and there was a big container at the top where ice, a big block of ice was delivered every morning by horse and cart, And you used to put this ice block into the top of the fridge, and that dripped down the sides all day, and it was caught in a tray at the bottom. And every morning this was delivered, and every morning you emptied the tray. And that was an ice chest. And it wasn't till years later that we got refrigerators. As far as a wash machine was concerned, it was only after the war that I got a wash machine, and then we had to mangle it by hand. The washing was in the tub, and then the mangle was above, and you put everything through the mangle, but manually, and then you hung up your washing. And of course, fridges and things like TVs only came in when we were living in Nelspruit by that time, and they didn't send TV to Nelspruit for quite a long time. And I said to my grandson the other day when he came to ask me, I said, you know, we had no iPads, nothing. He says, Gran, what did you do without an iPad and a cell phone? And you know, we seem to have more leisure in those days than we do today. We rush round. We've got all these appliances. We've got cell phones. We have deliveries. And, you know, I mean, in those days you couldn't keep meat. You got your meat and you ate it that day. And, you know, for instance, when I was at school, we had log books. And when we needed a log, you couldn't press a computer. I mean, there were no computers. I remember seeing the first computer at Wits. It was there, it must have been in about 1937, 38, and it would fill this lounge. It was so big. And now you get a computer and a watch. I have seen the most incredible developments over this last century in technology. And I've had a computer, but I've got rid of it now because I wasn't really using it. But I still, you know, my grandson of 9 years old taught me how to use a computer. And when I phoned him and said, I don't know this, he said, oh, Gran, I showed you. So I said, well, I've forgotten. Because I was coaching him with maths. And when he phoned me about something, I would say to him, Neil, I told you. So he got his own back. Now, where are we? My mother, when she was left a widow, I was 6. And she had been to Oxford. And she was very keen to, she loved the year she had. Do you want to know about her?
Yes, definitely. Wait, your father passed away when you were 6 years old?
Yeah.
So then it was just you, your siblings, and your mom?
Yeah.
Only you, okay.
My mother was a most amazing woman. My mother was the daughter of General Botha's eldest sister, and she married a Lancashire doctor who was district surgeon of Durban, and he actually fed Gandhi when he went on one of his eating strikes.
Wow.
Now, she grew up as a debutante, they called them. And girls in those days went to parties, they went for picnics, they went sailing, they did all those things to meet men, and then they were supposed to get married, and that was that. But she found she got to 25 and she wasn't married. That meant she was really on the shelf. And she decided she wanted to do something with her life. So against her father's will, she went and got a job as a student teacher at Durban Girls College, much against her father's will, as you can imagine. But that's how you became a teacher in those days. You were apprenticed in a sort of way. Anyway, when she was 30, she wrote to Oxford and asked if she could come to St. Hugh's College and do a year's geography course. Now that was, you know, for a girl to do that was quite something. And they wrote back and said, yes, she could do it, provided she did an entrance exam. So she wasn't even sure when she went to England that she could get in. But she went, and fortunately for her parents, they knew a woman who was going to be on board the same ship and asked her to chaperone my mother, because she was chaperoned in those days. Anyway, she went to Oxford. She passed her exams. She did a year in Oxford. But just before she left, she met my father. And they wrote to each other and they got engaged by letter. So when she came back, that was about 1914, just when war was starting. And they got married when she got back. Okay, now, where are we?
I'm wondering, did you study maths?
What?
Did you study maths as a subject of interest?
Oh, yes.
Or...
You see, my mother was very keen on education, as you can imagine. So when we were each born, we were insured for higher education. In other words, when we turned 17, we got 100 rand a year for 3 years each. And once my father died, my mother didn't pay any more premiums on it. So there was no question about not going to university. And my mother's friend said to her, why on earth do you educate your girls? They're going to get married. She said, my girls are going to be educated. And I needed it. I was a good scholar. I enjoyed school. I got a distinction in maths. In those days, nobody got more than about 1 distinction. I mean, today they get 8 distinctions.
I didn't get a distinction in maths, so that's very impressive. I couldn't manage it.
I loved it. And then I went to university and I did a BA with maths, and then I chose whatever. My mother was friendly with Professor Hofmeyr, and he said, give your daughter a wide education. So I did things like classical life and thought and anthropology.
I'm doing anthropology.
Did you? I loved it. In fact, I was sorry I didn't major in those. But as it happened, my maths has been the most fantastic thing in my life. And I got a job at Highlands North High, and I absolutely loved it. And then I got married in 1943, and because I was married, I lost my permanent job. Can you imagine it? That was the rule in those days.
Really?
Yeah. And the headmaster came to me. I got married in July, so he came to me and he said, I've got a daughter at Kingsmead, and they can't get a good maths teacher. Won't you go there next year? So I said, sure, it gives me a job. Because by that time my husband was up north in the army. And but I wasn't happy there. There was too much concentration on all these rich children. Anyway, at the end of this year, I resigned from Kingsmead and became vice head of the girls' clubs in Joburg. And then I did that for another year. Now, as soon as I matriculated in Pretoria, my mother had moved to Joburg by that time because my brother had went to university, and I was left with friends for another year as a boarder at Girls' High. When I matriculated in 1938, then I went to Wits, and my mother moved to Joburg. Now, my brother and I, as you know, were very close. And his best friend was Tank Bird. And he was called Tank because his name was Frank, but his slightly older brother, who's 18 months older than he was, couldn't say Frank, so he said Tank. He was born in 1918 when tanks first were made. So his parents thought this was quite fun, so he was known as Tank for all his life. Anyway, he was my brother's best friend. And so he was at the house a lot. And, he was like another brother in the house. And 2 years later, I was home full time. And I went to Wits. So we decided to get married, and married 2 days later.
Wow.
Well, he had embarkation leave, so this was quite a scrimmage because his mother was in Durban, my mother was in Joburg. He was in a regiment in Durban. So my mother and I went down, and we bought a dress, not a proper wedding dress, just a
Nice dress.
not a white long dress. And we got married, and we had a 10-day honeymoon. Then we didn't see each other for 2.5 years.
That's horrible.
It was horrible, but fortunately my brother was in South Africa at the time, and I still did things with him and his friends, which was very nice for me, but it was horrible. But we didn't expect the war to go on for so long. Anyway, he came back 2.5 years later. And I was phoned and told to go and fetch him at the main Joburg station at 11 o'clock on that day. It was a huge knot in my stomach. I thought, this man has been for 2.5 years in the army. Now, before he had gone, he had won a bursary to do a postgraduate apprenticeship course in Manchester at an engineering works, electrical. My husband was an electrical engineer, and so he could go straight after the war. He was paid a pittance while he was there, but we'd saved up during the war, and so we arrived in Manchester. And fortunately, when we got to London, my brother-in-law had stayed with such a nice lady in Manchester who had mainly South Africans as boarders, and we stayed there with her. My husband went up to Manchester to get accommodation for us, and I stayed with her, and she taught me to use, what do you call those cards you used to get, ration cards, and told me how it worked. We got 10 cents worth of meat a week, and we got very little stuff, you know, but we didn't get eggs, we got powdered eggs that came from Australia, I think. And fortunately, we were fortunate because my mother and mother-in-law used to send us food parcels, and we got very little sugar, and everything was rationed.
Wait, was the war still going on at this point?
Yes. No. This was after the war.
Okay.
But the ration after the war was even tougher, because then bread went on to ration as well. So you had to be very careful. And we had a wonderful 2 years in England. Manchester was wonderful in those days because every show that was put on in England, and the best conductors, orchestra conductors, used to come up to Manchester, and if a show went on, they put it on in Manchester before it went to London.
Really?
To try it out, yes.
What shows did you see?
I saw Margot Fontaine dancing.
Really?
I saw, who was that actress in Gone with the Wind? Vivian Leigh.
Oh, wow.
I saw her on the stage. We saw all these people. And one of the best conductors, now I can't remember their names anymore, so many of them. And we used to go to a lot of shows. I used to meet him in town after work, and then we'd go to an early show. And we went to a lot of shows. And I even visited some of the girls' clubs over there as well. I found it very interesting. And then our first daughter was born there. When we came back, we spent a bit of time in Joburg, and my second daughter was born there. And then I had a son in Nelspruit, in Velkom. And then we had about 4 years there. They were wonderful years because it was a town of young people. There was no bioscope, there was nothing. There wasn't even a shop there except it was the post office and a sort of everything shop. And we used to go to Odendalsrus, which was about 13 kilometers away, if we wanted to shop. And if the road got bad, you just went on the veld round the road. I mean, that's how we lived. And then they began to tar the streets where we were living. And the first shops opened in Nelspruit. It was small then. And who was born in Nelspruit was Peter. I had 5 children. Margie was born in England, Libby in Joburg, Jonty in Welcome, and back in Joburg, and Peter, my last Lomaki, was born in Nelspruit. So they went to, Margie and Libby were at school by the time we went to Nelspruit, and they had a junior primary and senior primary, and they were bilingual. And we had a very bilingual community down there, and we all loved the children being at school together because of apartheid, you know, and the schools were segregated too. And then they decided to build another primary school in Nelspruit. We protested like crazy because we didn't want the kids separated, but that was the law. So we actually had a wonderful life in Nelspruit. It's a beautiful place. It was near the game reserve. You could go in for the day if you wanted to. It took an hour to get to Miller Lane Gate, and then you could go in for the day and come home.
Did you have a car?
I beg your pardon?
Did you have a car?
A pass?
A car.
Oh, yes. Oh, if you want to put it in, my father got his first car, which was a Ford.
Of course.
That was in about 1926, I think, or 27. It had a canvas roof, which could go right down if you wanted it to. There were no windows. I mean, it was just open, no glass in the windows. If it started raining, you had mica sort of rectangles that you screwed in to keep the rain out of the car. Where were we? In Nelspruit now. We loved it in Nelspruit, and we made lovely friends there, and I think we were there for about 20 years. And the firm did very well, and my father was very inventive. He used to invent things, but he wasn't really a businessman, because he used to, like, he invented a roof ridging ventilator, which in the heat and corrugated iron roofs, it let the hot air out. But then I said to him, why don't you, he had a great friend who did roofs. And I said, why don't you phone Brian and let him manufacture this, and, you know, you can do something else. No, he said he wanted to manufacture them. And nothing happened because he was busy on inventing something else. He invented a very fantastic orange spray machine, you know, for the orange trees. It was called the Eagle. And that did wonderfully well. But, you know, he didn't carry things through, if you know what I mean. Anyway, we had a wonderful marriage. We were so happy. We had the 5 children we used to do. He was such a fantastic father. And he would sort of come through early on a Sunday morning and say, come on, kids, let's go to the game reserve for the day. Or he'd say, let's go and have breakfast at such and such a dam. And he was always full of these sort of, he'd get enthusiasm about doing things, and we led a most wonderful life. And we had our 25th wedding anniversary there. And a month later, my husband had the most terrible stroke. And he spoke absolute gibberish at first. I had to take him to a speech therapist. He couldn't understand, you know, as that speech was outgoing, he couldn't understand everything you said to him. And you know, he lived for another 30 years. It would have been much kinder for him if he'd gone when he had his stroke.
So how was he after the stroke? Was he...
He had a complete change in personality. And I stayed with him for 11 years. And then I was having a nervous breakdown because he wasn't the man I married, if you know what I mean. And two of my children were living in Nelspruit, Margie and Peter, and he went into one of these retirement villages and I went to Joburg. And fortunately, as my mother said, my children might need their education. I could teach maths again. Afterwards, I nearly had a breakdown. And then my children said to me, Mom, you must get out. And so I went to my brother because I didn't want one of my children involved. And then I got a flat in Joburg with very little money because that's all he gave me. So I started coaching in the afternoons. And it was wonderful because I enjoyed the teaching.
I'm sure it's quite a common question, but you were living in South Africa for this whole time. What was your experience of apartheid and everything that was happening while you were living there?
And then I stood in front of the post office for the black sash over something.
Were you part of the Black Sash?
Yes.
That's amazing. Oh, wow. Did you see much of it around you, or was it so segregated that you didn't really have an idea of what was going on?
Oh, no, no. You didn't know really how bad the situation was in South Africa. It was kept away from us.
Everything was censored.
Yeah.
Did you realize what was happening, like, closer to 1990, around about there?
Yes. I think the thing was that Soweto Rising, when that young boy was killed. What was his name?
Hector Peterson. Hector Peterson. I think it was him. June 16th.
Peterson, yes. Yeah. And when they wanted everybody to learn in Afrikaans, that was what kicked it off. And then we began to realize, and then you began to get a bit frightened. But so that's when I was very conscious of what was going on. But it wasn't in the newspapers, it was nowhere. And you know, in Nelspruit we only got TV when the man landed on the moon. I don't remember, that was about 1960, was it?
I think it was around there, yeah.
We still didn't have television in Nelspruit. They had television in Joburg, but not in Nelspruit yet. And I just listened to the radio. I happened to get up at 4 in the morning and I put it on and he was just about to step on the moon. Oh, a wonderful thing we did in England. I had an aunt, because you'll have to sort all this out afterwards, but I had an aunt who had a Grace and Favour apartment in Hampton Court Palace. And it was given to her because she was General Botha's sister. She was the youngest sister, and my grandmother brought her up because her mother died, and she went to the eldest sister and she brought her up. So she and my mother were like sisters, more or less the same age. Because there were 13 in General Botha's family.
Wow.
My grandmother was the eldest, and Aunt Mari was the youngest. So there must have been about 20 years between them.
Gee.
And she had this grace and favour apartment because she was a Botha, and also her husband did a lot of work for the Arbitration League after the First World War. This was after the Second World War. Yeah, after the Second World War. And she was given an apartment in the old part of Hampton Court Palace. Her bedroom was where Anne Boleyn was imprisoned.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
And the bedroom we were given on the second floor had a corner cupboard, and behind that cupboard was a staircase that went right down and had a tunnel to the Thames.
Oh my gosh.
And Charles I escaped down that staircase. So it brought history so to the fore. And I'd had a wonderful history teacher at school, and when she did Henry VIII's, boy, we knew all about his wives. And then to go into this place, you know, her kitchen was in the new part, and to get from the kitchen to the dining room was 2 meters, 2 yards, because the walls were so thick. They were 2 meters thick there.
Wow.
Because that's how they built in the old days. That was in the old part.
So, I mean, you've lived through a lot. You've lived for a very long
A
time.
huge amount.
What's been the most shocking thing to you that's changed or that you've seen develop?
Well, I mean, there was no such thing as online. I mean, we had no computers. I saw my first computer adverts.
The one that could have filled the room.
Yeah. So, you know, when I say to my great-grandchildren, I've got 21 great-grandchildren.
21.
Yeah.
That's impressive, wow.
But it's lovely. This was one of my grandchildren. They all look after me.
It's lucky. And what about this now, like living through a pandemic? Did you think it would ever happen?
Well, you know, again, I was very fortunate because just before the pandemic hit, I've got a daughter who's now retired. I've got 2 daughters over 70. I went to my one daughter's 50th wedding anniversary. How's that? But just before the pandemic started, Libby booked me a flight to Cape Town to go to her in Nature's Valley. Nature's Valley is the most beautiful Garden of Eden near Plettenberg Bay. And then I've got a granddaughter here who phoned Libby and said, look, I think you're going to be too late, because I was booked to go a week later.
Oh dear.
And she said, my driver can come on Monday morning at 5:30 and pick up your mom and take her down to you. So my caregiver and I were told on Sunday at 10:30 that we were going down there. And we left the next morning and drove straight down. And I spent 5 months with her. And then I came up here and stayed with Nicola, who'd sent me down. And then Anne came up and took me to, she's living in Makupa's Kloof near, between Polokwane and Zanin, up in the mountains in the forests. And then Lynn, my granddaughter, came out from England, picked me up, took me to her mother in Nelspruit, and we went in 2 days to a game reserve, came out and she brought me home, and I'm very grateful to be home again.
That's lovely.
Because it's lovely to be in your own space.
Agreed.
Are you in digs or?
I'm studying at Pretoria at Tux, and I was staying in digs, but as soon as this hit, we all got told to come back home. And there are some people who are back at the university now, but all of our learning is online.
Where is home?
Home, I live in Robindale, so I'm very close to here,
Oh,
actually.
now here.
Yeah. So I moved back home. I was in digs for about 6 weeks, and then I moved back home, and I've been there since March.
You know, I think it's so sad. Some of my loveliest time was at university.
Yeah.
We played tennis, we went dancing, we did so many things together. You met on campus, you visited each other, but you had gatherings just sitting on the lawn at Wits. And I don't know, they were such lovely days.
Yeah, it is sad, but you know.
We went dancing every Saturday night, you know.
Yeah.
And you've missed out on that.
If you had to look back at everything now, could you say what your biggest achievement or the best part of the life that you've lived so far?
I'll say this, when I came back to Joburg, I was very involved with the Women's Auxiliary of the Methodist Church. And when I was in Nelspruit, I was chair lady of the White River WA, and then I became social welfare secretary for the district, which was called the Northern Transvaal then. And then I came up here and I became district secretary for the Southeastern District, also doing the social welfare work. And then I became countrywide secretary for the social welfare work.
Wow.
And that was the most wonderful time. We would go and have meetings, you know. We had national meetings once a year, and we used to have the provincial ones or the district ones once a year. And they were wonderful meetings, and I grew a lot, you know, and having no support. My daughters once said to me, "Mom, you grew when Dad had his stroke," because there were so many. And then after he had his stroke, I was sitting at my desk, because he used to go to bed about 8 o'clock, and I was sitting at my desk reading an anthology of Matthew Arnold. And there was an article there about how you are given 24 hours a day. It's free. It's absolutely open. You have the choice of what you can do with those 24 hours. What do you do with them? And I was sitting there thinking, and then I thought, Helen Siner Rice should write on this. And I picked up a pen and I wrote a poem about it. And for the next 6 months, I was writing poetry left, right, and center.
Wow.
And I'd be cooking, and it would start coming through, and I knew if I didn't get a pen, then I'd write it down, it would be gone. And I've now had 4 books, and I'm editing a book for somebody, and in those books about 15 of my poems are printed in each book. Well, the one book is waiting to be printed now. And I'll tell you the story of this. I had a neighbor next door for 20 years, and then she left. And a new neighbor moved in. And she and I became very friendly because she was very involved in the church, and I was too by then. And she was here, I suppose, for about 2 months. And then I thought one day, we visited each other quite often. I thought, I must go and see Eileen. So I go there and I find she's got somebody else there, a man. And she introduced me and she said to him, Helen's 93. So then he says to Eileen, he's looking for an editor for his book. He's writing a book. So I said, David, I'll edit your book for you. I've done it before. So he said, well, I've got 2 others looking at it. I'll let you know. So about 2 weeks later, he phoned me and he said, will you do it? And when I got to know him, I said to him, David, did you say that because when you heard I was 93, you were scared stiff? He said, yes.
Shame.
Anyway, we launched his first book about 2 years ago. And now we've done a second book, which is waiting to roll, but until this is a religious book. It's called Dialogue with God, and it's David Sadie, and Sadie, and he is actually, to me, he's like one of the old prophets. And it's amazing, and he has these dialogues with God, talks to God. And then it came to the second book, the third, he's writing a third one now. And he sent me the first, I said, David, I'm 99 now. He said, it doesn't matter. So I just edited the first part for him, and I've loved doing it. He's a Catholic, and I'm a Methodist, and we get on like a house on fire. You know more or less. If you want to ask me more questions, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Because you won't meet any other 99-year-olds, that I'm sure of.
I don't think I will. This was a very lucky, a lucky encounter.
What degree are you doing?
I am studying geography, and my second major is in anthropology, so it's kind of like a social sciences degree.
But I enjoyed anthropology.
It's fascinating.
Open that second door there, and you can take one of my books if you like.
Oh, thank you. Is it this one here?
Yes, open that. Now on the bottom shelf, there's a book with...
Oh, wow. Which one? Is it Whispers of Love?
It's Whispers of Love.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And this is the poetry that you wrote?
Yeah.
It's incredible.